Have you ever known something? Have you ever known something that someone else didn't know, and you wanted them to see, you wanted them to know what you knew, and so you sort of set them up. You set them up to see what you could see. You sort of, for lack of a better term, you ambush them with the truth. Maybe you wanted to teach them a lesson, and so you're listening to them talking, and you kind of take them down the road that they're with. You know what the right answer is, but you need to kind of lead them along, and then somewhere along the line you sort of ambush them with the truth. I want to tell you an example. Now, this is not a parenting sermon. I cannot recommend this technique, but this is something that happened with Aaron and I and Owen when Owen's 16 now. When he was about 4 or 5 years old, he had, this is a mistake too, but just the way the floor plan worked in our house, he had his own bathroom in his room. And so when you give a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old their own bathroom, it's a setup for disaster. So one of the things that kept happening was that he kept unrolling, we never saw it in person, but he kept unrolling the entire roll of toilet paper. And so we would walk in and a brand new roll of toilet paper would be all over the bathroom floor. Some of it would be in the toilet, some of it would be in the shower. And wet toilet paper is just no fun to deal with. So we knew it was him. He was the only person, he was the only person that it could have been. So we knew that he was the one unrolling the toilet paper. So I remember Aaron and I went to him and we asked him, I think he was probably 5, and we asked him about, did you unroll the toilet paper? And he said, no, I didn't do that. And we knew it was him, right? And so we needed to take his thinking to its logical conclusion and then sort of ambush him with the truth. That was our decision at the time. Great parenting. So we asked him again, and he denied it. And so then I just thought, well, then what? Let's assume that he's right. So then I said, well, I mean, if you didn't unroll it, and I know I didn't unroll it, and Jonah didn't, and Emma didn't, and Mommy didn't, well, that means someone has broken into our house and has gone up to your bathroom and unrolled the toilet paper. We have an intruder, a stranger is coming into our house and unrolling the toilet paper. You told me that it wasn't you, so we probably need to call the police. So I said, Aaron, I think we need to call the police because someone has broken into our house and is unrolling the toilet paper. Great parenting, right? And so immediately you could just see the wheels turning in his head. He's like, all right, this lie is unraveling fast. So he said, no, you don't need to call the police. It was me. I did it. And so we got him to admit. So the punishment was roll it back up in a perfect roll. No, I'm kidding. So we ambushed him. Aaron and I knew what the truth was. We knew that he had unrolled the toilet paper, but we sort of took it to its logical conclusion. And that's what we're going to see this morning in this part of Romans. Paul is going to ambush us and ambush this audience. He wants them to see something and know something, and he's going to use this technique. Now, remember last week we talked about the audience of Romans. It was at the time it was sort of a mix of a Jewish audience and a Gentile audience. Remember, the Jews had been expelled from Rome for 5 or 6 years, and so when the Jewish Christians were gone, the Gentile Christians sort of rose up into leadership and filled those leadership roles. But then the Jews came back, and then there was sort of all this infighting about what was proper and how much of the law should we use and customs and all that kind of stuff. And so you've got this Jewish audience who grew up knowing God and knowing the law and knowing the oracles of God, and there was this pride of being Jewish. And then they had historically kind of looked down on the Gentiles. So the Gentiles were sort of the dirty, rotten scoundrels, right, that didn't know about God and were not following the law and were eating all these things that were unclean and doing all these things that were unclean. And so the Jewish Christians saw themselves as superior because they were told that they were the chosen people of God for a long time. Well, now Christianity is opened up to everybody. And so there's this tension of this one group feeling like they're better. And even the Apostle Peter struggled with this. At one point, Peter Many years after the resurrection, and he was planting churches, he struggled with eating with Gentiles because it had been so ingrained in his mindset that the Gentiles were the dirty, rotten scoundrels, if you will, to stay away from. So the Jews looked down on the Gentiles, and so there was sort of this us and them mentality. Those people over there are doing X, Y, and Z, and we know the truth. And especially the author here of Romans, the Apostle Paul was a Pharisee, and he was very steeped before he came to Christ, before Jesus came to him on the road to Damascus. He was very steeped in this Pharisaical thinking, where there's this us and them mentality, that the Jews were superior to the Gentiles. And so, but Paul wants this audience to see something, and he wants us to see something. And so he's going to spend the next 2 chapters sort of setting us up for an ambush, and we're going to see the ambush this morning. So last week we ended with sort of the theme verse of the entire book of Romans. And it is found at the end of chapter 1. It says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." And this gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, but also to the Greek. For in this gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, "The righteous one will live by faith." So this gospel reveals the righteousness of God, and we receive this righteousness by faith. And so that is the theme of Romans, is this gift of righteousness from Christ to us, and it is received on the basis of faith. It's not received, you don't receive the righteousness of Christ by trying to be righteous, by trying to do the right things. It's not by following the law. We're going to see all of the other attempts in the next 2 chapters. Paul is going to sort of tear down all the other attempts that people have at achieving righteousness. And so the entire gospel is this gift of righteousness, and Paul's going to unpack how that gift is received. And so this morning we're going to look at the second half of chapter 1. And so if in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, one of the things about the righteousness of God, because God is perfectly righteous, then what is his attitude towards sin? His attitude towards sin is that he hates sin because sin goes against his righteousness. It's a righteous indignation. And so God has this wrath towards sin, and it is baked into the cake of his righteousness. In order for him to be perfectly righteous, he has to oppose or hate things that are not righteous. There's a justice that is built in to his righteousness. So one of the things we talked about last week is what Romans does. One of the reasons it's so impactful is it helps you tell your story. So one of the things you're going to see this morning is it will help you. Romans 1 is going to help you tell your story. In order to understand why and how you received this gift of righteousness, you have to know kind of where you came from. The state of which you were at before you received this righteousness. The other thing we said last week is that Romans and the gospel is offensive. Remember, that was the first point last week. The gospel is offensive and it is insulting. So some of you might be offended this morning, and some of you might be insulted this morning by what I'm going to say. But remember, in order to change how we think, the way that we currently think has to be offended or has to be insulted. I have to insult, or the Spirit has to insult, or God has to insult the way you think now in order to get you to change. That's how changing of your thinking works. So this morning we're going to talk about God's wrath. We're going to talk about the wrath of God towards sin, God's attitude towards sin, and then its logical conclusion. But before we start, I want to talk about something, because there is sort of this debate between God's wrath and his righteousness, and sort of we hear God's wrath towards sin and also his goodness. And so if you don't understand this word wrath, you could sort of see them as opposing. How could someone who's perfectly loving and perfectly righteous have this wrath? Well, when we talk about wrath, it's not this crazy, explosive, angry wrath. It is a logical part, or it is an integral part of his righteousness. It is his hatred towards sin. It's not this explosive anger. Chuck Swindoll said it this way. He said, God's wrath is nothing less than a reasonable expression of his righteous character and his unfailing love when confronted with evil. His righteous and his goodness are not competing attributes. His righteousness and goodness and his wrath are complementing characteristics. His righteousness sort of dictates how he feels about sin and when confronted with evil. So the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. And then as we dive into the rest of chapter 1, you're going to see how the wrath of God is revealed. And so remember the audience. Remember that if this letter is being read to an audience maybe about this size, and they're listening, some in the audience are the Jewish audience, and so they're going to hear this beginning part, and maybe you'll hear this beginning part, and you're sort of like, well, that's not me. He's not talking about me. Well, thank goodness that's not a description of me. And then we'll see how that maybe changes as we go through this description. So it starts in I believe it's verse 18. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." So the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and against all unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. So we're starting to hear this them talk. We're talking about these other people who don't know God. And it says it's evident to them, for God has made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, being understood by what has been made, so they are without excuse. All right, so Paul is saying that the evidence that there is a God, the evidence that God exists is evident. It's obvious. The invisible attributes and the eternal power and the divine nature of God is obvious. And we're going to see it's obvious in creation, right? Like you look at, and the more we learn about science, it just becomes clear that this didn't happen by accident. The more we explore the cosmos and see just how big space is, and the more we zoom in on a microscope down to the small microscopic level, we see the intricacy of what God has created. And it becomes more and more obvious that this wasn't just a collision of a bunch of accidental things that happened. And then also it says it's evident within them. So it's evident within mankind, not just in how we were made physically, but how we talked about this 2 weeks ago in the promises of God. We talked about how deep within all of us there is this sense of justice and there is this sense of fairness. And we all feel when bad things happen, we all have this feeling that that shouldn't happen, that this is not how it's supposed to be. And so God breathed his Spirit within us. So deep within us, we all long to be in a different place and be in communion with God. Some of us don't know what it is. Some of those that don't know Christ don't know what that need is. But that is the need that is built within all of us. So Paul is saying that God's invisible attributes and his power and his nature have been perceived and are understood by what is made. And so no one has an excuse. All right, so far, probably you in the audience and the Jews in the audience are like, all right, well, the wrath of God is revealed against people who don't know that there's a God. Okay, well, I know there's a God, so okay, I'm avoiding the wrath of God. All right, it goes on, it says, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their reasonings, and their senseless hearts were darkened. All right, so we're starting to get an idea of this description of these people. They didn't honor God, they didn't know God, they didn't give thanks for God, they became futile in their reasoning, their senseless hearts were darkened. And so if you're one of the Jewish in this audience who have been having this perception of the Gentile people, you can kind of be like, yeah, can you believe those people? Can you believe? I'm so glad that's not me. I'm so glad I don't think that way. And so you could sort of imagine the Jews in the audience are sort of sharpening their elbows, right, to nudge their spouse or nudge the Gentile next to them. All right, and so now we've gotten to people that have rejected God, even though he's clearly seen in nature and clearly seen in themselves. They're futile in their thinking. And so then we're going to get to a couple of verses where it says, they exchanged, and it talks about what they exchanged. And then therefore, because they exchanged something, God gave them up. And so you'll see this pattern that mankind exchanged something, and God gave them up. And so what we see here is a freedom. We're designed with the freedom to choose. We're designed with this freedom to choose this exchange, and then God, who values our freedom, will give us up to the fruit of our decisions. We're made to choose. We were designed to choose. Think about Adam and Eve in the garden. God made Adam and Eve and said that they were good. And inherent in their design was the ability to choose. They were able to choose that fruit. So part of our goodness that we are created by God is this ability to choose. And real freedom comes from this ability to choose. It's inherent in the idea of freedom. And you have to understand that God values this freedom because he wants us to respond to him in love. And love has to be free. If it's obligation or if we're robots and we're forced to love, that is not love. Love inherently has this freedom. And God will honor our choices. Think about the story of the prodigal son. The son comes to the father and says, Dad, give me my inheritance so I can have it right now and leave. Well, the son or the father in that story could have said, no, that's a terrible idea. I'm not going to give you that. I'm going to continue to protect you here in our home. I'm not going to give you your inheritance. But in that story, Jesus wanted to portray that the father values the freedom of the son to choose. And so the father gave his son up to the fruit of those choices. And so we as human beings have the freedom to choose. And so God will give us up to the result of those choices. He says, claiming to be wise, they became fools. They exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible mankind, of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. All right, so now the Jews in the audience are like, yeah, can you believe that the Gentiles would ever worship like birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures? I'm so glad I'm not like those people. And because they exchanged, then we see, therefore, God gave them up. They have the freedom. So God gave them up to the vile impurity in the lust of their hearts, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for falsehood, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. They put themselves at the center of the story. Who is valued? Who should be worshipped? Mankind should be worshipped. My feelings and what I want, and mankind should be worshipped. That what is true is how I feel. What is true is what I want. The creation is put at the center and worshiped rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. All right, so now if you're in this Jewish audience, you're like, well, sometimes I don't know, this isn't going well, right? All right, well, it continues on. It says, for this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for that which is contrary to nature. And likewise, the men, too, abandoned natural relations with women and burned in their desire toward one another, males with males committing shameful acts and receiving in their own person the due penalty of their error. All right, so let's stop here for a second because this is kind of a hot topic in the United States in 2020, 21, 22, 23. Some people desperately want this to not be on the list. But let's be pretty clear. It is on the list. And it might be offensive to some people that this is on the list. But hang on, wait with me, because we're all going to get offended here in a minute. But we're going to stop here for a second because there are other scriptures in Genesis and in Leviticus and in 1 Corinthians and Timothy that clearly say that this is outside of God's design. But that is not the specific point. You're going to see where this is going. This is on the list. It's not going to come off the list. That's what's true. But that is not where this passage is going. That's not the point of this passage. And so if you hang with me for a second, we're all going to get offended here in a minute. I think. I'd like to offend you. Okay. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a depraved mind to do those things that are not proper. People having been filled with all unrighteousness and greed and evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. All right, so now you can imagine the Jewish audience. There might still be some that have this word in their head. Phew! All right, well, he describes some other people. Maybe the whole idea of worshiping the creature rather than the creator, but I don't really do that. And then all that other stuff about burning with passion and all that, I don't do that. And then all that malice and murder, I don't do that. And so there's sort of this, phew. All right, however, here comes the hammer. Oh, wait a minute, before the hammer, I'm sorry. All right, and so now you can sort of imagine this attitude. Jesus talks about this same attitude in a parable in Luke 18. In Luke 18, he tells the story of two men that went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other was a tax collector. And the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed. And the Pharisee said, God, I thank you that I am not like other people. I am not like the robbers and evildoers and adulterers or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give a tenth of all I get. And so this is the mentality that some could get. Some of us who have avoided the things on that list. We sort of have this phew mentality, and then we say, I thank you so much, God, that I'm not like those other people. All right, but here comes the hammer. They are gossips. They're slanderers. They're haters of God. They're insolent and arrogant and boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents. We don't have to raise our hand, but I think that might just put all of us on the list. Without understanding, untrustworthy, unfeeling, and unmerciful. Wait a minute. That's on the list? How are you feeling about the list now? What's on the list with people that deny that God exists? Disobedient to parents. Is that offensive that disobedient to parents is on the same list as idol worship? Or that gossiping is on the same list as murder? And although they knew the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death. They not only do the same, but they also approve of those who practice them. So not only is gossip on the same list as murder, and disobedience is on the same list as idol worship, Paul says those who practice such things are worthy of death. And not only do they do it, but they approve of those who practice them. So even if you don't do those things on the list, and all of us have been disobedient to parents, all of us have probably told a story about somebody that was none of our business to share, right? So the whole idea here is that Paul is leading towards this ambush of the audience. So you sort of start off with the big sins, you sort of start off with the big, huge rejection of God things, and then you see by the end that we are all on the list. If I gossip about someone, I deserve the guillotine. That's what this verse is saying. All who could practice such things are worthy of death. All right, so now we're done with the they talk, and now we're going to the you talk. So here's the hammer from Paul. He's switching from they to you. Therefore, you have no excuse, you foolish person, every one of you who passes judgment. For in that matter in which you judge someone else, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same thing. So at the beginning we saw that they had no excuse because creation clearly reveals God. So you have no excuse of not seeing God. But they have no excuse of not seeing God. And now you have no excuse, every one of you, you who condemn yourself. For you and you who judge practice the same thing. You're on the list, and that's the whole point. Paul is bringing us to the point where he can drop the hammer. We are all on the list, and murderers and disobedient to parents is on the same list. And so because of that, you can't judge someone else's eternal location. You don't have the right to judge someone else's eternal location because you're on the list. Now, understand what I'm saying, because this gets twisted in our culture too. We can judge what is right and what is wrong and what is wise and what is unwise. If you have a friend that's getting ready to jump out of an airplane without a parachute, you can't be like, well, I'm not going to judge. Like, you can show him wisdom. Like, hey, we're 12,000 feet up. Put on a parachute, right? So there's a difference between judging people and judging behavior, judging what is wise and what is unwise. And we see in our culture now, oh, you shouldn't judge, you shouldn't judge. And that is true. We should not judge people's eternal location, whether they're in or out, whether they're going to heaven or not. That is not our job to judge. But we can look at, especially in our own lives, we can look at behavior that is wise and unwise, and in the lives of our children and in our friends. It's loving to talk about, to help people see what is true, but it is not loving to judge people's eternal location. And we know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. But do you suppose this, you foolish person who passes judgment on those who practice such things, and yet does them as well, that you will escape the judgment of God? No one can escape the judgment of God if you base it on your own ability. If you base it on your own ability to try to keep up any of the things on that list, outside of Christ's gift of righteousness, whatever measure you use, you will fail. And the reason is because there's a root change that has to happen. So see, there's different fruit but it's the same root. And unless we change the root, then we shouldn't expect different fruit. That's the message of Christianity, is not about your fruit, but where you're rooted. We want the world to see that they need to be re-rooted in Christ. And then them and the Spirit will work and grow in knowledge and understanding, and the fruit will follow. But the mistake that we make is we try to change people's fruit when they have a root problem. We need to point from the root. Point to a new root. And just think about this. I mean, apart from Christ, outside, if you take Christ's righteousness out of the picture, when you're talking to your Christian and your non-Christian friends and family, and you're looking at fruit rather than the root, you know, we're all there's an equality of being on that list. We're all on the Titanic together, and we're arguing about who has a better haircut, who has more in their 401k, whose hair looks better, whose outfit is nicer, who makes more money. Hey, you know what? We're all on the Titanic, and we're all going down. We all need the same rescue. We all need the same rescue boat, the rescue boat of Christ's righteousness. And yet, we stand on the deck of the Titanic and we judge people's hair and clothes and 401k and all of these other fruit things when all of us need the same lifeboat. Sometimes we think if we highlight someone else on the list, it will diminish or cover up that we are on the list. And so what a lot of times people do is they'll take the part of the list that the things that they don't do, and they beat people over the head with it. And the whole point of this chapter is that we are all, apart from Christ, are on the same list. The list sort of levels the playing field. And you'll notice in Scripture, you know, this is a long letter. He's giving this list in the context of the gospel. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 6. You'll see sort of the same sort of list, but this is a much shorter version. He gets to the conclusion much faster. He says, "Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of heaven? Do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral or idolaters or adulterers or homosexuals or thieves, nor the greedy, nor those who are habitually drunk, or verbal abusers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God." So if this is who you are, unrighteous, you will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. But then he goes right on. He says, "Such were some of you. But," this is a big but, "you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and in the Spirit of our God." So we don't have to change what a sin is, but we need to change how we address the sinner. We don't have to change what is sin. We need to change what the message is to the sinner. It's unloving to not tell the truth, not only about what sin is, but where the rescue is. It's always in the context of where the rescue is. We need a new identity, a new primary identity before any of the others can be addressed properly. You need to have the root change, and that is the message to this world. So Paul's going to continue the ambush. We're at the end of chapter 1, beginning of chapter 2. This is a long form letter that was designed to be read all at once. And so Paul is going to continue in this letter to tear down all other attempts at righteousness. He's going to tear down all the other ways that we might try to prop ourselves up outside of the righteousness of God. He's going to talk about any standard that you use outside of Christ's righteousness, you are going to fail. Whether it's the Jewish law or whatever standard you come up with to try to achieve righteousness, there will be failure. And then he reaches the conclusion of this tearing down in Romans 3:23 through 25. Now, most of us, if you grew up in church, you probably memorized Romans 3:23, and we sort of skipped the next two verses after that. It says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." That's 3:23. "And all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ." God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. So we see, and Paul will continue to build the case, all of us are on the list. No matter what standard you use to try to justify yourself outside of Christ's righteousness, you will fall short. You will fail. You have failed. You are on the list. You're on the Titanic, and you need to be on the rescue boat. And it levels the playing field of whatever sin you might be dealing with and whatever sin your neighbor and your families might be dealing with. We're all on the same list, and we all need that root change. So he's going to tear down all the other ways. And so really, for you to understand this gift of righteousness that you receive through the gospel, you have to understand where you started. This is the part that helps you understand your story. You need to know where you came from. We are all lost without Jesus, and there is no other righteousness to be had outside of Christ. And that is the beginning of these building blocks of this foundation of faith that we're going to build through this Romans series. You have to start there in your story of where you were apart from Christ's righteousness. There's no other righteousness to be achieved, no matter how hard you strive, no matter how many rules you follow. So in our 1996 clip art here, we're building the foundation of faith. And Jesus is the cornerstone, and the beginning of these building blocks that Paul is giving us is that we are all lost without Jesus, and there is no other righteousness. Let's pray.